Hey there. I know why you're here. You're looking for a story that will help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Something calming, a little mysterious. Something that carries your mind away. Well, you've come to the right place. Before we begin tonight's journey, do me a little favor. Tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Even just a good night. It really helps more sleepy souls like you find their way here. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin tonight's story. What happens when a mother's love isn't enough to stop her son from spiraling? When warnings fall on deaf ears and pride becomes his greatest downfall? This is the story of David, a bright boy who turned his back on the very woman who sacrificed everything for him. He chased the streets, ignored every plea, and laughed at the values she tried so hard to teach. But life has a way of humbling even the most stubborn hearts. And when tragedy struck, it was too late to say, "I'm sorry." What did he lose? What did he learn? And how did one final letter change everything? Stick around, because this isn't just a story. It's a lesson, a warning, and a redemption you'll never forget. This is he ignored his mom's advice, and it cost him everything. David sat on the edge of his bed, phone in hand, ignoring the gentle knock on his door as his mother, Ruth, called his name with the kind of softness only years of sacrifice could teach. Her voice, once his comfort, now felt like a chain to him, pulling him back every time he tried to stretch beyond the walls of their small two-bedroom apartment on the east side of town. She had raised him alone, working double shifts as a nurse, giving up her own dreams so he could chase his. But lately, David saw only restriction in her rules and resentment in her reminders. Ruth would often sit him down, looking into his eyes with the ache of a mother who saw her son slipping away, warning him that choices made in anger often invite consequences that linger longer than the thrill of rebellion. But David, freshly 17, wanted the world to know he was no longer a child, tired of being told what to do, tired of living paycheck to paycheck, tired of hearing about doing the right thing. He had started spending time with boys from school who wore danger like cologne and laughed in the face of authority, their words bold, their nights wild, and their lives seemingly free. Ruth's warnings grew more desperate as his silence grew louder. But David wasn't listening anymore. He believed freedom was found outside, not at home, and he believed his mother's love was just another form of control. The tension grew with every slammed door and skipped dinner, turning warmth into ice and love into quiet war, as David pulled further into his world of shadows and flashing lights. Ruth tried to hold on, cooking his favorite meals even when he didn't show up, praying quietly in her room, and leaving notes with gentle reminders that he was still loved, still seen, still worth saving. David laughed with his friends at her notes, calling her old school and soft, telling them that she just didn't get it, that she didn't know what it meant to survive out here in the real world. But every time he looked into her eyes, even for a second, guilt twisted in his chest like a knife. Because deep down, some part of him still remembered when she used to hold him during storms and sing lullabies in the dark. Ruth would stay up late, waiting for the creak of the door that meant he'd come home safe, even if it was past midnight. And every time he did, she'd breathe a prayer of thanks and ask no questions. He never said thank you, never asked how her day was, never noticed the tired way she moved, or the pain she hid in her knees and her heart. He thought she would always be there, no matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he pushed, because mothers don't break until they do. That night, as he slipped out again, headphones in and hood up, He didn't notice her standing in the hallway, hands trembling, eyes full of tears, whispering, "Please God, don't let him be lost." David's world began to shift the moment he started following Jackson, a sharp-tongued boy with a crooked smile and a reputation for stirring up trouble and walking away clean. Jackson had swagger, confidence, and street smarts that David admired, calling him Big Bro, even though Ruth always said a real brother would never lead you where you don't belong. Ruth had met boys like Jackson before. She'd buried dreams because of them, traded her youth for scars, and she could smell the danger on him like gasoline waiting for a spark. David didn't care. He was drawn to the thrill, to the adrenaline of being part of something bigger than school and chores and curfews, something that made him feel alive. He started skipping classes, lying about his whereabouts, coming home with money he couldn't explain, and bruises he brushed off with a laugh. Ruth begged him to talk, to come clean, to let her help, but he just looked through her like a stranger and said, "I got this," as if her love was now irrelevant. She tried grounding him, hiding his shoes, locking the doors, but he found a way out every time, and each time he did, something in her soul splintered a little more. That Sunday, when he missed church for the third time in a row, she lit a candle and whispered his name through tears, asking God to save him before the streets swallowed him whole. It was around this time that Ruth stopped sleeping, her nights filled with pacing and prayer, her hands clutched tight to the locket David had made for her when he was 10. The apartment, once filled with laughter and music, now echoed with silence and the distant thrum of passing sirens, each one making her heart lurch with fear. David noticed, but he told himself it wasn't his fault. She was just being dramatic. She needed to chill. He was just living his life like everyone else his age. But deep down, when he lay alone at night, even with the music turned up loud, her face haunted him, especially the way she looked at him now. Not with anger, but with sadness, like she was watching someone die slowly. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from Jackson and Trev, tempting him with easy money, late-night runs, and the kind of reckless fun that made you forget there was ever a price to pay. Ruth started keeping a journal, writing down everything she wanted to say, but couldn't, because David wouldn't listen. Pages filled with memories, hopes, and prayers that she might one day read to him if he ever returned to her heart. The distance between them grew into a canyon filled with regret, and though they shared a roof, they lived in two different worlds, one built on survival and sacrifice, the other built on rebellion and risk. And every morning, Ruth would place a hot meal on the table he never touched, whisper, "I love you," into the silence, and hope that somewhere, some part of him still heard her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline and the sky bled orange, David came home smelling of smoke, his eyes red and his shirt torn in a way that told more truth than his lips ever could. Ruth sat him down, her voice soft but firm, and begged him to stop, to choose life, to understand that love sometimes means saying no, even when it hurts. David exploded, accusing her of not trusting him, of trying to control him, of never letting him breathe, and his words cut deep, tearing through years of sacrifice with the sharpness of ignorance. She didn't fight back, didn't scream, just let the silence swallow his rage, and looked at him with eyes that had seen too much loss to waste time on pride. "I raised you better than this," she whispered, more to herself than to him, and he rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath as he disappeared into his room. That night, she sat on the couch with a photo album, flipping through pages of a boy who once laughed with her, danced with her, dreamed with her, and wondered where that boy had gone. David lay in bed with his headphones on, but the music couldn't drown the ache in his chest, or the memory of the way her voice trembled when she said, "You don't have to do this alone." And in the space between anger and guilt, between pride and pain, a storm was beginning to form that neither of them saw coming. The morning after the fight, David didn't speak a word to Ruth, brushing past her as if her presence was just another obstacle on the way to freedom he thought he deserved. She stood by the kitchen counter in her scrubs, holding a mug of coffee she never drank, her eyes following him with a quiet desperation that cracked more each time he walked away without looking back. Ruth wanted to scream, to grab him by the shoulders and shake the rebellion out of him, but all she could do was whisper a prayer under her breath and hope it found its way to wherever her son's heart had wandered. David met up with Jackson at the corner store, both of them laughing too loud, pretending they had no cares in the world, but deep down David was trying to laugh away the growing guilt pressing on his chest. They talked fast and walked faster, heading toward a neighborhood David had only heard about in whispers, a place where wrong decisions weren't corrected with scolding, but carved into flesh and bone. Jackson had a plan, an easy job, quick money, no risks, or so he claimed. But something about his voice, too calm and too sure, made David's skin crawl. Still, David said yes, not because he trusted Jackson, but because saying no would have meant going home and facing his mother's eyes, and that was a pain he wasn't ready to feel again. Ruth moved through her day at the hospital like a ghost, smiling through the pain, nodding through her exhaustion, but never quite able to shake the worry that clung to her like a second skin. Her co-workers asked if she was okay, and she'd smile and say, "Just tired." But the truth was that every silence from David felt like another heartbeat she might not get back. She texted him throughout her shift, short messages laced with love and longing. "Eat something. Be safe. I love you." But none of them received replies. In the quiet moments between patients, she'd press her forehead to the wall and pray for protection she couldn't give, and a miracle she couldn't earn, not knowing where he was or what lines he was about to cross. At lunch, she pulled out her Bible, the same one she read to David from when he was a boy, and flipped to the verse about prodigal sons, wondering if the story still held hope for hers. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages, remembering the night he was born, the way he gripped her finger as if promising he'd never let go. And now he was slipping so far away she could barely feel him. She left work early, heart racing with the sense that something was wrong, something bigger than the usual arguments and missed dinners, something that felt like a scream on the edge of silence. And as she walked home in the fading light, she looked up at the sky and begged God for one more chance, one more day, one more sign that her son wasn't too far gone. Meanwhile, David and Jackson stood behind the liquor store, hidden in the alley where the walls smelled of old urine and fresh danger, as Jackson laid out the plan like it was just another game. The idea was simple. Go in, grab the cash from the register. No weapons, no one gets hurt, just intimidation and speed. And David, nervous but eager to prove himself, nodded like he understood. His palms were sweating, heart pounding, but he told himself this was his way out, his first real chance to take control of his life and get the kind of respect he thought he deserved. Jackson handed him a ski mask and said, "This is your moment, bro." And David took it with shaking hands, trying to ignore the voice in his head that sounded too much like his mother. They waited until the store was almost empty, then stormed in, voices raised, adrenaline surging, and in a matter of seconds, everything spiraled into chaos. The cashier resisted, a struggle broke out, and Jackson, who'd sworn no weapons, pulled out a knife that David had never seen, and suddenly, the air was thick with screams and shattered glass. David froze, heart in his throat, watching as the knife flashed and blood hit the floor, realizing too late that this wasn't freedom. It was a nightmare unfolding before his eyes. Back at home, Ruth lit a candle in the window like she always did when David was late, the small flickering flame her symbol of faith in the face of fear. She paced the living room, glancing at the clock every few minutes, her hands wringing the dish towel she never quite managed to put away. She tried calling him once, twice, 3 times, but each ring felt like a heartbeat unanswered, and her voice cracked when she left the last message. Please just let me know you're okay. Hours passed, the candle burned low, and she sat by the window in silence, heart sinking with each second that stretched into something like dread. She imagined the worst but prayed for the best, refusing to believe that the boy she raised could truly be lost. Not yet, not fully. When the knock finally came at midnight, it wasn't David, but 2 police officers with tired eyes and heavy voices, asking if she was the mother of a 17-year-old named David Carter. Her knees buckled before they even finished the sentence, and the world tilted sideways as her worst fears took shape in the cold night air. And as they explained what happened, that he had been arrested, that there had been blood, that someone had nearly died, Ruth felt something inside her fracture beyond repair. David sat alone in the holding cell, the concrete bench cold beneath him, his hoodie stained and hands trembling, his mind replaying the night like a broken film reel. He hadn't meant for anyone to get hurt, hadn't known Jackson had a knife, hadn't even gotten a chance to run before the sirens screamed through the air and swallowed him whole. He'd never been more scared, not even as a kid in the dark, and now the weight of his choices pressed down on him like 1,000 bricks he could never lift. He thought of his mother, of her soft voice and worried eyes, of the meals she made and the warnings she gave, all brushed aside like dust. And for the first time in a long time, tears filled his eyes. The other boys in the cell were quiet, used to the cold and the quiet. But David couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop thinking about the way his mother would look at him now. He felt like a stranger to himself, his reflection in the cracked mirror, mocking the pride that had led him here, and the boy who'd once dreamed of college and music now sat under flickering lights, wondering if he'd just thrown it all away. And in the silence of that cell, beneath the weight of guilt and fear, David whispered the one name he hadn't said in weeks: Mom. The night air inside the police station felt colder than the concrete beneath David's sneakers, and the silence that filled the space between his breaths felt louder than the chaos that brought him there. He curled into the corner of the holding cell like a child, hiding from monsters under the bed. Only now the monsters were real, and they wore handcuffs and consequences. His fingers, once so quick to clench into fists when anger rose at home, now trembled as he tried to remember how it felt to be safe, to be loved, to be right. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed, and someone screamed. But David didn't lift his head, because he knew that the world outside had changed, and he wasn't sure if he had a place in it anymore. Every second stretched into a quiet kind of punishment, a slow unraveling of every lie he'd told himself, that he was in control, that he didn't need guidance, that rebellion made him stronger. Now he sat beneath buzzing lights that flickered like dying stars, haunted by memories of his mother's voice, echoing warnings he refused to hear. And in that stillness, David finally admitted to himself that pride wasn't power. It was poison, and he had swallowed it whole. Ruth didn't sleep that night, not even for a second, because sleep was a luxury grief couldn't afford, and worry had stolen all her peace. She sat in the corner of her room with the same Bible in her lap, Pages opened to verses she could no longer read because her eyes were too wet with tears and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She thought about the first time David got a scraped knee and ran to her, arms open and face crumpled, trusting that her hug could heal whatever hurt him. But now he was behind locked doors, surrounded by cold men and colder justice, and she couldn't reach him through walls, bars, or the silence that had grown between them. Her heart ached with the weight of 1,000 if-onlys. If only she'd been stricter or softer or louder or quieter. If only she could turn back time and try again. But regret didn't rewind reality, and the truth was that David had to face the fire his own choices had sparked, and she could only pray that he'd survive the flames. She stared at the candle that had long burned out on the windowsill, the wick blackened like her hope, and whispered, "Please protect him, Lord, even from himself." And in the darkness, she waited for a call, a knock, a sign, anything that would let her believe he wasn't lost forever. Morning came slow and unforgiving, as grey clouds hung low over the city, casting long shadows over broken families and broken boys alike. David was led from the cell to a small interrogation room where the chairs were too hard, and the questions came too fast, and the officers' eyes were too tired to pretend they cared about anything but confessions. He stared at the table in front of him, tracing invisible shapes with his fingertip, pretending that if he didn't speak, maybe the story wouldn't be real. They asked about Jackson, about the knife, about whether it was planned, and all David could think about was his mother's hands. Strong, soft, always working, always holding, and now probably trembling like his own. When he finally opened his mouth, his voice cracked, not from fear of punishment, but from the shame that now lived in his throat like a permanent scar. He told them everything, every plan, every lie, every step he took away from home. And when they asked if he had anything else to say, he whispered, "I wish I listened to her." The officers looked at each other, then down at their notes, not realizing that in that one sentence, David had just crossed the most painful line from boyhood to consequence. David woke up to the sound of clanging metal and a voice too loud for a place so empty, reminding him that freedom had a sound, and this wasn't it. The juvenile facility smelled of stale food and bleach, and the walls echoed with the hollow laughter of boys pretending they weren't afraid. He kept to himself, moving through the routine like a ghost, wearing someone else's skin, not speaking unless spoken to, not looking anyone in the eye for too long. His thoughts were a carousel of regret, each turn bringing back another moment he wished he could erase. His mother's tears, Jackson's cold eyes, the click of the cuffs. Sometimes at night, he would press his face into the pillow and scream without sound, because there was no space in this place for weakness, only survival. The counselors spoke in circles, using words like rehabilitation and self-awareness, but all David wanted was to go home and take back every angry word he ever threw at his mother like a weapon. He didn't know how to say it, but deep in his soul, something was waking up, something tender and trembling. Maybe it was remorse, or maybe it was the memory of love. Back home, Ruth poured herself into prayer and work, each day stretching like a bridge between hope and heartbreak, held up only by her will to believe. She visited David every week, never missing a day, even when the weather was cruel, or her body felt like it might give out from the strain of grief. Her church friends brought casseroles and promises, but none of them could fill the silence that followed her into the house, into David's room, into the spaces where laughter used to live. She'd walk past his closed door and run her fingers over the frame like she was trying to remember what peace felt like before rebellion cracked their world in half. At night, she'd sit by the window watching the stars as if they held the answers, whispering her son's name like a hymn, over and over, until the sky grew quiet again. She didn't understand how love could hurt this much and still keep beating. But every tear that fell reminded her she was still fighting for him, even if he didn't know how to fight for himself yet. Sometimes she'd find herself looking at his baby pictures and wondering where the time had gone, how the sweet boy who once held her hand now held the weight of choices too big for his age. But through it all, she never stopped believing that the boy she raised was still in there, buried beneath the pain, waiting to come home. Inside the facility, David began attending group sessions where other boys talked about drugs, gangs, broken families, and every kind of pain imaginable, but none of them sounded like him. At first he stayed silent, arms crossed and head down, because admitting weakness felt like pulling your ribs apart to show the bleeding heart beneath. But then one day a boy named Marcus spoke about his mother dying while he was locked up, and something in David cracked open like thunder splitting the sky. That night he couldn't sleep, haunted by the idea that his mother might not be there when he got out, that his pride might have cost him the chance to make things right. The next morning he raised his hand for the first time in a session, and when he spoke, his voice shook like a branch in a storm. But he didn't stop. He told them about Ruth, how she loved him more than he deserved, how he threw her lessons in her face, how he thought he knew everything and ended up with nothing. The room was quiet when he finished, but in that silence, David felt something new, a strange, uncomfortable lightness, as if the truth was starting to set him free. From that day on, he didn't just show up, he participated, because healing doesn't begin until humility takes root. Meanwhile, David received his court date, one that would determine if he could be released early based on good behavior and a rehabilitation plan supported by staff and family. He felt a storm inside him as the date approached, equal parts fear and determination, because this wasn't just a hearing, it was a reckoning, a turning point. The counselors helped him prepare, the chaplain prayed with him, and Ruth sent a letter each day that week, each one ending with, "I'm proud of you no matter what happens." On the day itself, David wore the plain uniform, but he stood taller, his back straight and his voice steady, because he was no longer a boy hiding behind defiance. He was a son walking toward truth. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he read from a speech he'd written by hand, shaking but strong, apologizing to his mother, to his community, and to himself. The courtroom was silent when he finished, and Ruth's eyes brimmed with tears, not of pain but of awe, because that was her son, the one she raised, the one she believed would come back. And though the ruling wouldn't come until the next week, something more important happened that day. David forgave himself, and for the first time he let go of the shame. After the hearing, Ruth and David sat together in the visitation room, a single table between them, but no walls could keep the love from flowing freely now. He told her everything, about Marcus, about the letter, about how he woke up every day thinking about her prayers and trying to live like he deserved them. She held his hands and kissed his knuckles like she did when he was small, saying, "You're growing, David, and growth is what grace looks like when it hurts." They laughed a little, cried more, and promised to keep rebuilding the bridge between them, no matter how long it took or how many storms they had to weather. For the first time in years, they spoke without tension, without fear, like two survivors who had come through the fire and still found each other. David said, "I don't want to waste this second chance," and Ruth smiled and replied, "Then don't live it, love it, and never forget where you came from." They sat there long after the session ended, until the guard had to tap the table, but their hearts remained full. And when they hugged goodbye, it wasn't a farewell, it was a beginning. The week after the hearing stretched long and quiet, like the space between lightning and thunder, filled with the tension of waiting and the fear of disappointment. David counted the days in silence, each sunrise a reminder that time was moving, but answers were still stuck in someone else's hands. He tried to stay focused, doing his tasks, attending group, helping others, but in the quiet moments, his mind always drifted back to the courtroom. He would replay the sound of his own voice, the way it cracked mid-sentence when he mentioned Ruth, wondering if the judge had seen that as weakness or sincerity. The other boys said not to get his hopes up, that early releases were rare, that the system wasn't built to forgive. But David wasn't the same boy who believed what everyone else said anymore. He believed what his mother said, that you don't need the world to believe in you if you learn how to believe in yourself. So, one night, while the others slept and the moon painted quiet silver lines across the floor, David began to write a letter he didn't know if he'd ever send to Jackson. The pen trembled in his hand as he stared at the blank page, because how do you write to someone who betrayed you and still somehow feels like part of your unfinished story? He didn't know where to start, whether with anger or grief or the confusion that still clung to his chest, like a weight he couldn't shake. But then he remembered the way Jackson laughed when they were kids, the loyalty they once shared, the brotherhood they swore by even when the world turned cold. So he began with that, with the memory of how close they once were, and let the words pour out, not from bitterness, but from the ache of something lost. He wrote about the fight, about the betrayal, about the way it all felt like a slow-motion fall that neither of them saw coming until they hit the ground. He didn't excuse Jackson's choices, but he also didn't pretend his own hands were clean, admitting where pride and ego had driven them both to the edge. By the time he finished, his hand hurt and his heart ached, but the page was full, and for the first time, he felt like he had finally said what needed to be said, even if Jackson never read it. Meanwhile, Ruth was busy preparing a small welcome home corner in David's room, even though no official decision had been made yet, because hope, when active, builds room for miracles. She dusted the old desk, folded fresh sheets, and placed a worn Bible on the nightstand, opened to the verse she used to whisper over him when he was little. Every corner of the room was touched by her hands, every picture straightened, every shelf organized like she was making space, not just for his body, but for his healing. She didn't know if he would come back the same, or if the pain had made him someone new, but she knew she would love him through every version of himself he brought home. Each night she lit a candle by the window and sat in the quiet with a heart full of longing, and a faith made stronger by fire. Her prayers weren't elaborate, just the whispered name of her son again and again, until it felt like even heaven had to listen. And though she was tired, and her body ached with waiting, Ruth smiled through the tears because she knew this wasn't the end. It was the middle of something being rewritten with grace. Ruth got the call just before lunch, and for the first time in months, she let herself dance in the kitchen, spinning like the young girl she once was, arms open wide in joy. The lady on the phone smiled as Ruth cried, unable to hold back the flood of emotion that poured out like a storm breaking over the dry land of her soul. She immediately called her pastor, then her sister, then a neighbor who had been praying with her every Tuesday, and every person on the other end wept with her, because they had all carried a piece of her pain. Ruth baked David's favorite meal that afternoon, seasoning it with memory and hope, humming the lullabies she used to sing to him when he had nightmares. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew love would meet it first, standing on the porch, arms open, waiting to catch the sun she never stopped waiting for. She lit the candle again, but this time it wasn't a symbol of longing. It was a celebration, a light that said, "Come home, son, I never gave up on you." And when she went to bed that night, she slept without tears for the first time in a long time, her heart full of gratitude and her pillow damp with joyful exhaustion. David's last morning in the facility was quiet, not because no one cared, but because everyone understood the weight of goodbyes when they come wrapped in transformation. He hugged Marcus tightly, promising to write, and told the younger boys to fight for themselves before the world tries to do it with chains and courts. The guards nodded respectfully, one even whispering, "Good luck, kid," with a rare softness that felt like a blessing disguised as a farewell. As he packed his things, just a few books, letters from Ruth, and a sketch he'd drawn of his old neighborhood, David felt both older and lighter, like someone who had finally learned how to carry his own story. He looked one last time at the room that had witnessed his lowest and highest moments, whispering a silent thank you to the walls for not giving up on him. Outside, the sun felt warmer, the air sweeter, like the world itself was welcoming him back with open arms and unseen applause. And as the facility gates opened and he stepped into the waiting arms of his mother, everything he once broke began, slowly, to come back together. David debated whether to send the letter to Jackson, folding and unfolding it so many times that the creases were soft, like fabric, and the ink slightly smudged from his fingertips. He asked the chaplain what to do, unsure if reaching out would reopen wounds, or maybe plant the seeds of peace. And the man answered with a story instead of advice, about two brothers who spent a lifetime waiting on the other to say sorry, and died, never knowing how much love could have been saved by one simple letter. So David sent it, heart pounding like it might shatter his ribs, placing it in the outbox, like he was letting go of a piece of his past wrapped in truth. He didn't expect a reply, didn't even want one, but something about mailing it made him feel less bound to the weight of everything he couldn't control. In group therapy, he shared what he did, and for the first time the counselor placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "That's what strength looks like." And even though his hands still shook when he thought of the unknown, David felt lighter, like honesty had given him back a part of himself he didn't know he'd lost. That night, he slept without waking up to regret chasing him down in his dreams. The decision came on a Thursday morning, delivered in a plain envelope with his name handwritten in neat, cold ink that didn't hint at what lived inside. David opened it slowly, afraid that if he read it too fast, he might miss something important, or worse, he might misread a no as a yes in his desperation. But the words were clear. Early release granted, with mandatory counseling and a 6-month follow-up program that Ruth had already agreed to. He stared at the letter for a long time, rereading the words like they might disappear if he blinked too fast. And then something unexpected happened. He cried. Not the quiet tears he'd learned to hide behind walls, but loud, full-bodied sobs that came from a place deeper than guilt or shame, from the fragile space where relief meets redemption. The guards didn't say anything, just gave him a moment, and one even nodded softly as if to say, "You earned this." David folded the letter with trembling fingers and whispered, "Thank you to no one in particular. Maybe to God, maybe to Ruth, maybe to the boy he used to be who didn't think this was possible." And in that moment, the future didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like a second chance, painted in the colors of grace. Ruth noticed the change in David slowly, like the first green sprout pushing through winter's frozen ground, fragile but full of promise. During her visits, he began looking her in the eye again, and though the words were few, the tears that followed were loud enough to say what his lips still couldn't. She'd bring books, devotionals, and letters from people who still believed in him, and for the first time in a long while, he accepted them without protest. One day, She brought him a letter he had written to himself as a child, tucked away in an old box she found in his closet while cleaning. It was full of dreams, promises, and a handwriting that still had innocence in it. David held the letter like it was made of glass, reading every word with shaking hands and a throat that burned with sorrow, because the boy who wrote it never imagined the mess the future would become. Ruth didn't say much, just gently placed her hand over his, letting her warmth speak where words couldn't reach. In that moment, something inside David shifted, a stirring of who he used to be, who he still could be, and who he wanted to become. And for the first time he whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom." And though it wasn't everything, it was a beginning. The next few weeks became a quiet transformation, a slow unraveling of ego and a stitching back together of everything he once broke inside himself. David started mentoring new arrivals, helping them adjust, telling them what not to do, and warning them about the kind of pride that leads to regret. The staff noticed and began giving him more responsibilities, small signs of trust that felt bigger than any reward he ever earned before. He wrote letters to Ruth every night, even if he couldn't always give them to her, because writing them made him feel closer to her, made him feel like her son again. He stopped pretending he was invincible, stopped pretending he was fine, and let himself be seen, not just by others, but by the boy in the mirror who had been lost for too long. He thought about Jackson every day, wondering how a friend could become a stranger so fast, and he hoped one day he'd be brave enough to apologize for the hurt he caused. But most of all, he thought about Ruth, about the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the way she never gave up on him, even when he gave up on himself. And with every decision, every small act of discipline, David was building a ladder out of his own ashes, climbing slowly toward redemption. Outside those cold walls, life kept moving. Seasons changed. School semesters passed, and birthdays came and went, marked only by Ruth's faithful presence and the cards she sent. She baked him his favorite cake every year, even though he wasn't there to eat it, and left a candle burning on the windowsill as a quiet symbol of belief. Her friends told her to take a break, to focus on herself, to move on, but Ruth just smiled and said, "He's still my son, and I'll be here when he's ready to come back." She knew motherhood wasn't about convenience. It was about covenant, and her love was stitched with threads that didn't break, even when stretched thin. At church, she began volunteering more, pouring her heart into helping other mothers with wayward children, because pain, when shared, becomes purpose. She still missed him every day, still cried some nights, but now her tears were mixed with hope, because she saw the flicker of change and believed it could become a flame. And when people asked her how she kept going, she'd say, "You don't give up on someone you prayed for, even when they give up on themselves." Ruth had faith that wasn't loud or flashy, but quiet, enduring, and unshakable. At home, Ruth finally received the call she had been dreading and praying for in equal measure. The voice on the other end, too formal, too calm, asking her to come down to the station. She dressed slowly, each button and zipper feeling heavier than it should, as if even her clothes understood the weight of a mother's heartbreak. She didn't cry anymore. There were no more tears left, but her chest felt hollow, like someone had scooped out her soul and left her behind in pieces. The cab ride felt like a funeral procession. Every streetlight, another pause between grief and action. Every bump in the road a reminder that her son's life had derailed. When she arrived, they led her through cold halls that smelled of despair and disinfectant, and she followed in silence, her heart thudding with each step. Then, finally, they brought her to him. David, small and shivering, and so far from the boy she raised. sitting behind glass like a ghost she barely recognized. And in that moment, their eyes met, not with anger or blame, but with something deeper, something ancient, something holy, an ache only a mother and son could share. David couldn't breathe when he saw her, because the shame weighed heavier than the steel doors behind him, and her eyes weren't angry. They were tired, and that was worse. He expected yelling, or disappointment, or that tight, forced smile she used when she was holding everything in. But instead, she just looked at him with tears that didn't fall, and love that refused to die. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to fall to his knees, and beg her to take the pain away like she used to, when he had nightmares, and skinned knees and math tests. He didn't understand, but all he could do was look at her, broken and blinking back guilt, while she placed her hand gently on the glass, her palm trembling but firm. Ruth didn't say much, just, "I'm here," and in that moment, David knew he didn't deserve her presence, but he needed it more than he'd ever needed anything. He placed his hand over hers on the other side of the glass, and they sat like that, two people with hearts stitched together by suffering and sacrifice. And in that silence, something shifted, something sacred, the beginning of repentance, the stirring of redemption, the soundless promise that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Later that evening, Ruth spoke to a social worker who explained the severity of David's charges, her voice calm but distant, as if this were just another name in another folder. Ruth listened carefully, holding back the urge to cry again, and asked questions with the kind of grace only a woman raised by storms could possess. She learned about plea deals, court dates, and the importance of character witnesses, and somewhere in the middle of the conversation she asked, "What can I do to help him come home?" The woman paused, glanced at her notes, and said, "He'll need to show the court he understands the damage he's caused, that he's ready to change, and he'll need people who believe in him." Ruth nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around her purse strap, as if holding on to something real might keep her from floating away in grief. She agreed to attend every hearing, to write a statement, to support his rehabilitation, because she knew that while David had made choices, she was still his mother, and mothers don't quit, even when their hearts are bleeding. As she left the station, she whispered to herself, "He's not just a mistake, he's a lesson waiting to be learned." And with that, she carried both their burdens home. David was moved to a juvenile facility that night, the van cold and quiet, the seatbelt digging into his side, like a reminder that this wasn't a dream he could wake up from. He stared out the window as the city passed in blurs and shadows, his reflection in the glass looking older, harder, more lost than he ever imagined. At intake, they took his shoelaces and his belt, gave him a uniform that didn't fit, and told him the rules like a teacher, tired of being ignored. His room was a cell in all but name, with grey walls and a single bed that creaked when he sat. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't make it feel like anything but punishment. That night, he lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything he gave up in one night: freedom, dreams, his mother's trust, and the tears finally came. He wept like a child, not for the fear of bars or courtrooms, but for the love he took for granted, the lessons he tossed aside like trash, the warnings that now echoed louder than any siren. And in that empty space, David made a silent vow: if he ever got a second chance, he would never ignore her again. The taxi ride home was quiet, with only the soft hum of the engine and the occasional blink of a turn signal filling the space between David and Ruth. But the silence wasn't cold, it was full of everything words couldn't carry. David stared out the window as the city passed by, its edges unfamiliar after months away, yet somehow still holding fragments of the life he left behind. Ruth kept glancing sideways at him, as if trying to memorize the new lines in his face, the maturity in his posture, the scars behind his eyes that told stories she hadn't yet heard. Their hands touched briefly, and she held his for a moment too long, like she was afraid he'd vanish again if she let go too soon. The driver didn't speak much, sensing something sacred in the quiet between mother and son, and when they turned into their street, Ruth's breath caught in her throat. The house looked just the same, but it held a different kind of warmth now, one carved by prayer, pain, and the quiet determination of a mother who refused to give up. As they stepped out of the car and stood on the cracked walkway, David took a deep breath and whispered, "I'm ready," and Ruth, with tears in her eyes, simply nodded. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and rosemary, familiar scents wrapped in memory, like the air itself had been saving a place for him to return to. David paused in the doorway of his old room, the walls still adorned with photos from his childhood, baseball trophies, drawings, and a picture of him and Ruth in the park from when he was 10. Everything had been cleaned and cared for, but nothing had been changed beyond recognition, and that balance of old and new comforted him in a way he hadn't expected. He placed his duffel bag down gently, as if afraid to disturb the stillness, then sat on the bed, fingers tracing the wooden frame like it was sacred. Ruth stood in the doorway watching him, arms crossed over her heart, and when their eyes met, she smiled through her tears. "I kept it the way you left it," she said softly, and David, overwhelmed by the grace in her voice, stood and wrapped his arms around her. They stayed like that for a long moment, mother and son held together by forgiveness, love, and the quiet miracle of a second chance. Dinner that night was filled with simple food and sacred conversation, every word they exchanged weaving threads back into the torn fabric of their bond. David spoke slowly, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wanted to get it right, to make sure Ruth felt the weight of his regret and the depth of his change. He talked about the therapy sessions, the books he read, the fights he witnessed, and the truths he uncovered about himself and the pain he caused. Ruth listened without interrupting, her eyes filled with empathy rather than judgment, and when he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "I knew you'd come back to yourself," she said, her voice trembling, "but I never stopped praying that you'd come back to me too." David tried to respond, but his throat tightened, and all he could do was nod, as the tears came rushing back like waves breaking on a broken shore. In that moment, under the soft kitchen light and the warmth of home-cooked food, they weren't just a mother and a son, they were two souls slowly being stitched back together. And for the first time in years, David felt full, not with food, but with peace. In the days that followed, David kept a quiet routine, waking early to help Ruth around the house, reading in the afternoon, and journaling in the evenings like the counselors had taught him. He found small joy in folding laundry, trimming the bushes, washing the dishes. Chores he once resented now became rituals of redemption, each act a way to show Ruth and himself that he was no longer the boy who ran from responsibility. Sometimes he'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the neighborhood children play, their laughter soft reminders of the innocence he'd left behind, but could still protect in others. Ruth watched all this quietly, never pushing, never questioning, allowing him the space to grow at his own pace, trusting the seed she planted with prayer and patience would continue to bloom. They spoke often about the past, but never stayed there too long, always returning to the present like it was a gift they were both learning to cherish. On Sundays, they returned to church, and the pastor welcomed David with an embrace that held no hint of shame, only pride in the path he was walking. And every night before bed, Ruth whispered the same prayer she had whispered when he was little. Lord, keep him close. And this time David whispered, Amen, right beside her. But not everything was perfect. And David knew healing came with pain, because every now and then he'd wake up with the memory of the handcuffs or the sound of the gavel still echoing in his ears. There were moments when shame crept in like a shadow, whispering that he didn't deserve to be home, to be forgiven, to be free. And in those moments, he'd sit at his desk and write, not to escape, but to process. Sometimes he wrote to Jackson in his mind, asking questions he didn't expect answers to, trying to make sense of the betrayal, the anger, the friendship that had turned into fire. Other times, he wrote to himself, letters to the boy he used to be, full of empathy and warning, so he'd never forget where the wrong road led. Ruth noticed the shifts in his mood, but gave him space to feel without rushing him to be okay, because she understood healing was more than just returning home. It was learning how to live again. She'd leave small notes around the house, like reminders of love. You are not your past, or your story still matters, or I'm proud of you always. And every time he read one, David felt a little stronger, a little steadier, a little more certain that he was becoming who he was always meant to be. One afternoon, while David was sweeping the porch, he noticed a familiar figure across the street. Jackson, standing beside his bike, hands in his pockets, looking like a ghost from a chapter that hadn't quite ended. David froze, the broom slipping from his hand, his heart thundering in his chest, unsure if this was a confrontation, a coincidence, or something in between. Jackson didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there watching with a look that flickered between guilt and hope, like he was trying to decide whether to walk away or say something that mattered. Ruth stepped outside, then saw them both, and gently touched David's arm, whispering, "It's your call." For a long moment, David just stood there, breathing heavy, trying to measure whether forgiveness was bravery or foolishness, whether silence would be strength or cowardice. But then he remembered the letter he sent, the choice he made to be better, not bitter, and he nodded once, more to himself than anyone else. He stepped off the porch and began to walk toward Jackson, each step slow but certain, carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. And when they finally stood face to face, Jackson opened his mouth, but David spoke first. "You showed up. That's a start." David looked at the boy who once shared his dreams, and now stood as a symbol of betrayal, and for a moment he didn't know what to feel. Anger, grief, relief, or some painful mix of all three. He thought about the long nights in juvie, the fights, the therapy, the shame, and most of all, the quiet strength his mother had poured into him every step of the way. He remembered the promise he made, to never let bitterness write the next chapter of his life, to never let someone else's betrayal define who he became. So with a breath that felt like it came from somewhere deeper than his lungs, David nodded slowly and said, "I don't trust you, but I don't hate you either." Jackson looked stunned, like he had expected either a punch or silence, and David added, "It's going to take time, maybe a lot of it, but maybe we start here." The words hung in the air like a peace offering carved from broken glass, fragile but real, and as Jackson nodded, wiping a tear from his cheek, David felt something inside him loosen, something old and heavy, and finally beginning to heal. Ruth watched from the porch, her hands clasped tightly, her heart pounding with the tension of a mother, watching her son choose between old wounds and new wisdom. She had prayed for this moment, feared it, and longed for it in equal measure, because while she had always taught David to forgive, she also wanted him to protect the parts of himself that were still healing. As she saw him walk back toward the house, leaving Jackson behind on the sidewalk, she saw something in his posture that hadn't been there before. Strength, not in muscle, but in choice. David looked up at her as he climbed the steps, his face unreadable but calmer somehow, like a storm had passed and left behind a different kind of sky. Ruth opened the door and didn't say anything at first. She just pulled him into a hug that said more than words ever could. After a long moment, she whispered, "That took courage, son," and he nodded, leaning into her warmth, like a child finding his way home again. And for the first time since everything fell apart, Ruth knew her boy was finally truly becoming a man. That night, David sat at his desk, the same desk he once used for homework, and hiding text messages, and opened his journal with a sense of quiet purpose. He wrote about the day, about the conversation, about the way forgiveness felt less like surrender and more like setting himself free from someone else's mistake. He wrote about Jackson, about how people sometimes hurt the ones they love most when fear becomes their compass instead of truth. He wrote about his mom, her strength, her sacrifices, the way she loved him even when he was impossible to love. And most of all, he wrote to himself, not the boy who got arrested, but the man who chose to heal instead of hate. When he finished the last sentence, he closed the book and placed it beside his bed like a sacred artifact from a battle he had survived. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves, the stars blinked above, and for the first time in a long time, David slept without nightmares. The following morning, something shifted, small, almost imperceptible, like the quiet cracking of ice before spring emerges. David joined Ruth in the kitchen and asked if he could cook breakfast, and she smiled like he'd just offered her a gift she'd waited years to receive. As they scrambled eggs and buttered toast side by side, they laughed about old memories and joked about how he used to burn everything but cereal. Ruth glanced at him while pouring tea and said, "You're different," and David smiled and replied, "I had to be, because who I was almost destroyed us." They sat at the table and bowed their heads to pray, not out of routine, but out of reverence for a new chapter that neither of them thought they'd live to see. After breakfast, David helped with the dishes and told her he wanted to start applying to jobs, to rebuild his life, one right decision at a time. Ruth didn't cry, though she wanted to. Instead, she nodded and said, "Whatever you need, I'm here." Word began to spread in the neighborhood that David was home, and while some people kept their distance, others came by with cautious smiles and warm words. Mrs. Jenkins from next door dropped off cookies, saying she always knew David would turn things around, and Mr. Hassan offered to help him fix his bike so he could get around easier. David felt awkward at first, unsure if he deserved their kindness, but Ruth told him, "People remember how you made them feel, not just what you did," and that gave him the courage to keep showing up. He volunteered at a local center, helping younger boys learn music and art, sharing pieces of his story not to shock them, but to remind them they weren't alone in their struggles. Slowly, piece by piece, trust was rebuilt, not just with others but with himself, because every good day was proof that he didn't have to repeat the past. And through it all, Ruth remained his anchor, never bragging, never preaching, just loving him with the quiet strength of a mother who knew storms could birth stars. In the warmth of community and the safety of home, David was learning how to rise, not as a victim of betrayal, but as the author of his own redemption. Ruth met him at the door with open arms and eyes that searched his face for any sign of defeat. But when he smiled and said, "I got a job," she pulled him into a hug so tight it felt like she was holding the broken pieces of their past and putting them back together. They sat on the couch, side by side, while he told her about Carl, about the rejection, about the diner, and about the way one yes erased 1,000 no's. Ruth listened like she always did, with her whole heart, her whole face, and the kind of attention that made David feel like his words mattered. She didn't give advice or caution him with warnings. Instead, she simply placed a hand on his knee and said, "I'm proud of you, David, not just for the job, but for how you didn't let the first no stop you." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw the lines on her face as chapters of every sacrifice she'd made to hold their world together. "I just want to make it right," he said, voice trembling. "For everything I put you through, Ma, I want to earn your peace." And Ruth, with tears in her eyes, whispered, "You already are, baby, you already are." That night, David stood outside on the porch with a cup of tea in his hands, looking out at the stars and thinking about all the times he had cursed the sky for being silent. Now the silence felt different, less like punishment and more like space being cleared for something better, something sacred. He remembered the boy he used to be, angry, loud, reckless, always running from something he couldn't name, and he grieved him, not with guilt, but with compassion. "You didn't know better," he whispered to his younger self, "but now you do, and that's enough." Behind him the screen door creaked, and Ruth stepped out, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders as she joined him. They stood in silence for a while, side by side, two survivors of the same storm, each learning how to trust the calm. "You know," she said quietly, "your father would have been proud of you too." David didn't reply right away. He just nodded slowly and let the truth of her words settle into his bones. Work at the garage was hard, sweaty, loud, exhausting. But David showed up every day before sunrise, eager to prove he was more than his past. Carl didn't say much, but every once in a while he grunted in approval or tossed David a sandwich, and over time, that silence grew into something like trust. The other guys at the shop started warming up to him too, asking questions, sharing tools, even cracking jokes, and David soaked it all in like sunlight after a long winter. He never once mentioned jail, never led with excuses, and never asked for special treatment. He just let his work speak louder than his story. And when payday came and Carl handed him an envelope of cash, David didn't go out or celebrate with noise. He went straight to the grocery store and bought everything on Ruth's list, down to the last tomato. She laughed when he walked in with bags in both hands, shaking her head and saying, "I told you I'd take care of it." But he grinned and said, "Not this time, Ma. Let me take care of you." That night, they had dinner by candlelight, not for romance, but for reverence, and David whispered a prayer of his own. "Thank you for not giving up on me." The weeks passed, and with every oil change, tire rotation and spark plug replaced, David felt his old self being washed away. Layer by layer, his body grew stronger, his mind sharper, and even the way he walked began to change, not with swagger, but with certainty. Ruth watched him bloom with quiet awe, her heart both full and fragile. Knowing that growth often came with growing pains, there were still hard days, days when memories came back, like ghosts, and guilt tried to claw its way into his chest. But David had learned how to face them instead of run. He wrote more, prayed more, even started helping a neighborhood teen who reminded him too much of himself at 15, angry and lost. One evening, after dinner, Ruth found a note on her pillow. For all the years you cried alone, this is my promise to be your peace now. And in that moment, she wept, not because she was sad, but because love, when restored, is the most powerful kind of healing. Days passed with no sign of Rico, and for a while it felt like maybe the storm had passed. Maybe the threat had been a warning shot instead of a bullet. David returned to his routines, early mornings at the shop, evening dinners with Ruth, and weekend mentoring sessions at the community center, where he now volunteered. One Saturday he spoke to a group of boys who reminded him of himself. Sharp eyes, harder hearts, and shoulders that carried more than they should. You're not what they say you are, he told them. Voice steady. You can rewrite your story. Mine started with a cell, but it didn't end there. They listened, not all at once, but enough to make him keep showing up. Enough to make the work feel like purpose. Ruth came by once, just to watch from the back, and afterwards she said, "Every time you help one of them, you heal a little more of yourself." That night, he sat on the porch again, not in fear, but in reflection, looking up at the stars as if they were winking approval. He felt safe, not because danger was gone, but because he finally knew who he was when it returned. But peace is fragile, and healing is a slow dance. One misstep from shattering again, and that misstep came late one night when David heard the soft rattle of the back gate. He froze mid-sentence while reading on the couch, his instincts louder than reason, and moved quietly to the window to see a figure in the yard, tall, hooded, moving with purpose. He grabbed a flashlight, whispered Ruth's name without panic, and motioned for her to stay hidden as he stepped outside, heart pounding but steps firm. "Who's there?" he called, voice louder than he expected, trembling just beneath the surface. The figure turned slowly, and David's stomach dropped. It wasn't Rico, but another member of the old crew, one who owed him nothing but pain. "They're coming, man," the guy said, eyes wild. "Rico's not done. He's bringing trouble." David took a slow step back, realizing the storm hadn't passed. It had only gathered strength, and as the man disappeared into the night like smoke, David knew that the next chapter wouldn't be written in peace, but in the fire of everything he'd become. That evening, as the sunset spilled gold over the cracked sidewalk, David stood at the front of the church, where he used to loiter with boys who never made it past 25. He knocked on the pastor's office and asked if he could speak during Sunday service, to tell his story, not to glorify the past, but to testify to the price of ignoring those who loved him most. The pastor nodded, eyes wide with surprise but full of encouragement, and offered him a seat to prepare. But David just stood there, looking at the altar where his mother had knelt for him so many nights. "I want to tell them what it cost me to stop listening," he said softly, "and how I almost lost the only person who ever saw me when I was invisible to everyone else." The pastor said, "Then speak from that pain. That's where truth lives," and handed him the microphone as a symbol of trust. David left the church with a strange sense of peace, like redemption was no longer a distant concept, but a road he could finally walk. That night, he wrote his message by hand, each word a confession, a scar, a tribute to the woman who never gave up. And when he finished, he folded the paper carefully and placed it under Ruth's favorite Bible verse on the kitchen counter. Sunday morning came with the weight of anticipation, and the church was fuller than it had been in months. The pews crowded with familiar faces who'd heard rumors, but never the whole truth. David stood beside the pulpit in a simple shirt and slacks, nothing flashy, just honest. And when he began to speak, the room leaned forward as if the walls themselves wanted to hear. He spoke of rebellion, of anger, of stealing from the very hand that fed him, of nights spent in alleys instead of classrooms, of ignoring the advice that was meant to save him. He told them about Ruth's sacrifices, selling her jewelry to pay his bail, walking miles to visit him in juvenile detention, praying with blood in her knees. He confessed that every "I told you so" she never said echoed louder in his heart than anything she ever did say aloud. "I learned the hard way that obedience isn't weakness," he said, his voice breaking. "It's a form of love, of honor, of legacy." And when he ended with, "If you have someone still praying for you, still fighting for you, don't wait until you almost lose them to open your eyes," there wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary. After service, the crowd formed a circle around him, not of judgment, but of embrace, of support, of people who wanted to believe they could change too. One young boy, no older than 16, walked up with tears in his eyes and said, "I've been fighting my mum too, but I don't want to end up like you had to." David knelt down, looked him in the eye, and said, "Then listen now, before life teaches you the way pain taught me." Ruth watched from a distance, standing near the last pew, her heart full, her prayers answered not by miracles, but by her son's return to himself. Carl was there too, arms folded, smiling quietly, knowing some battles are won, not with fists, but with courage to walk a new path. As people filtered out of the church, David walked back toward his mother, and she hugged him the way only a mother can, stronger than fear, softer than memory. And in that embrace, he knew something unshakable, that he had finally become the man she always knew was buried beneath the pain. The man she never stopped waiting for, even when he had stopped waiting for himself. That night, as Ruth washed dishes and David dried them beside her, they talked about little things, recipes, neighbors, the state of the church roof. But beneath every word was a deeper peace. No more hiding, no more pretending, no more running from the mirror or the shadow of the boy he used to be. "You think they'll come back again?" Ruth asked once, gently, not from fear but from practicality, always planning, always protecting. David shrugged, smiled faintly, and said, "Maybe, but next time I won't face them alone, and I won't face them as who I used to be." She nodded, handed him the last plate, and wiped her hands, then reached for the small radio and turned on soft gospel music. They sat on the porch in the quiet that followed, sharing roasted corn and cold drinks, as stars blinked down like tiny, eternal witnesses. In the distance, dogs barked, cars passed, life moved forward, and David leaned back, rested his head, and whispered, "I finally get it now, Ma. I really do." David barely slept that night, sitting in the dark corner of his room with a baseball bat across his knees, and his eyes glued to every creak the house made. The silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, filled with the echo of old footsteps, whispered names, and the ghost of a world he had tried so hard to leave behind. Ruth came in once, placed a warm blanket on his shoulders, and didn't say anything. She just looked at him with eyes that had seen too many storms, and trusted he'd weather this one too. He wanted to tell her to leave town, to take the church van and drive until the danger was behind her, but he knew she wouldn't leave him. Not again. Not ever. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the hooded figure's words replaying in his head, a grim premonition disguised as a warning. He thought about calling Carl, the police, even the pastor, but something inside him said this had to be faced with more than law. It had to be met with truth. So he waited, not in weakness, but with the quiet, steady strength of someone who had something, someone worth protecting. The next morning, The air felt thicker, like the wind itself was nervous, blowing in gusts that rattled windows and bent the trees like hands reaching for help. David moved through the house like a sentry, double-checking every lock, every blind, and every doorway that led into the life he and his mother had fought so hard to rebuild. At the breakfast table, Ruth placed his plate down as usual, 2 eggs, yam slices and stew, but her eyes lingered on him longer than necessary, as if memorizing his face. "Don't let darkness turn you cruel," she said softly, her voice trembling just a bit. "You already made it out once, David. Don't let them pull you back in." He nodded, chewing slowly, letting the food fill not just his stomach, but his soul, reminding him of who he was now, not who he used to be. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the front door that didn't sound like neighbors or deliveries, but like history demanding an audience. David stood, walked to the door, and peeked through the peephole, heart hammering as he saw Rico, flanked by 2 others, all dressed in black like a funeral for forgiveness. This was it, the moment where choices would echo louder than intentions. David opened the door but left the screen locked, his voice firm and flat as he said, "You need to leave, Rico. This ain't your home, and I'm not your soldier anymore." Rico tilted his head, smirking like a wolf smelling fear. But David didn't flinch. Not this time. Not after all he had survived to stand here. "You really think walking away is that easy?" Rico growled, tapping the handle of something beneath his coat that made David's skin crawl. "I gave you my time, my loyalty, my scars," David said slowly, gripping the edge of the door. "But you never gave me peace. And I don't owe you anything that costs my mother's safety." One of the men beside Rico muttered something, reaching into his jacket, and for a second, David saw his life flash before his eyes, not in fear, but in clarity. He stepped back, slowly reaching behind the door where he'd hidden the pepper spray and the bat, unsure if today would end in blood or mercy. But then Ruth's voice rang out from behind him, calm, unwavering, like scripture in the storm. "The police are already on their way, boys. So unless you want to meet God early, you better start walking." There was a tense beat of silence, broken only by the sound of tires rolling slowly down the street as a patrol car came into view. Its lights off, but presence unmistakable. Rico cursed under his breath, backing away with a warning glare, and said, "This isn't over, David. You'll always be one of us, and you know where to find us when that lie falls apart." David didn't respond. He just shut the door gently, locked it, and leaned against it, breathing out the weight of everything that almost was. Ruth stepped forward, touching his shoulder with a steady hand, and said, "You made the right choice, even if it doesn't feel like it yet." His knees buckled a little from the adrenaline, and he dropped to the floor, not in defeat, but in the kind of release that follows restraint, letting himself cry where only she could see. "I didn't let you down, Ma," he whispered, as her arms wrapped around him and held him close. "I finally didn't let you down." And though his world was still shaking, for the first time, he felt the ground beneath him wasn't going to collapse. But peace, David soon learned, does not come without tests, and some chapters try to rewrite themselves even after you've turned the page. A week later, while working at the garage, a black sedan pulled up, and a man stepped out, tall, lean, with a shaved head, and a stare that made David's stomach twist. It was Rico, one of his old crew members, someone who hadn't been seen in years, but had clearly found his way back, with old wounds and older intentions. "Heard you got out, cleaned up, got a job," Rico sneered, tossing a cigarette onto the ground and grinding it with his boot. David wiped his hands on a rag and kept calm, stepping between Rico and the garage door like a shield, unwilling to let the past cross that threshold. "Whatever you want, I'm not that guy anymore," David said quietly, hoping his voice didn't betray the fear that flickered behind his stern gaze. Rico laughed, low and bitter, and replied, "That's cute, but I didn't come for you. I came for what you owe." And just like that, the cost of his past came crashing back into the present. Carl saw the tension from inside and walked out with a crowbar in hand, the kind of quiet protection only men who've seen things offer without asking questions. Rico backed up slightly, raising his hands like a mock surrender, but his eyes never left David's, full of threat and memories of blood debts never repaid. "Tell your boy we ain't done," he muttered to Carl before turning back to David. "Clean or not, you owe, and debts don't get wiped like records." He drove off with a screech, leaving behind more than the scent of exhaust. He left the unmistakable weight of unfinished business. David stood frozen, fists clenched, breath shallow, as Carl placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You don't owe anyone who would drag you back into hell." That night, David didn't sleep. He sat on the porch with Ruth beside him, explaining everything, even the things she hadn't known. And when she didn't judge, didn't flinch, just said, "You're not alone in this," he realized that strength sometimes sounds like softness and feels like a hand that never lets go. Over the next few days, paranoia clung to David like a second skin, every shadow feeling like Rico, every silence filled with dread. He started walking Ruth to church, to the store, even to her knitting group, always watching, always listening for the wrong kind of footsteps. He didn't want to tell Carl, but the older man wasn't blind. He knew a hunted look when he saw one, and pulled David aside after work. "You either let the fear own you, or you face it with something stronger," Carl said, handing him a small card with a police contact he trusted. David hesitated, torn between old codes of the street and new codes of survival, knowing that either choice would cost him something. That night, after Ruth fell asleep, he dialed the number, reported Rico's threat, and gave everything he knew, choosing courage over silence for the first time. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about protecting the peace he'd finally built, the peace he had no intention of losing. And as he hung up the phone, his hands shook, not from fear, but from the quiet roar of a man becoming whole. The courtroom was colder than David expected, not in temperature but in atmosphere, a silent tension that clung to the air like old regret waiting to be revisited. He sat beside his court-appointed counselor, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his head bowed slightly, not out of shame, but reverence for the gravity of this moment. Across the room, the judge leafed through papers that summarized years of his life in paragraphs that barely scratched the surface of who he had become. Ruth sat 3 rows behind him, her hands clasped tightly together, whispering prayers under her breath, each word a stitch in the quilt of hope she wrapped around them both. As the hearing began, David's heart thudded in his chest like a warning bell, yet he held his posture steady, breathing through the storm inside. His counselor rose to speak, detailing his progress, his employment, and the support he had rebuilt with the woman who never gave up on him. And as the judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly into David's eyes, time seemed to pause, holding its breath for whatever would come next. The judge's voice was even but firm, his words walking the line between accountability and grace as he recounted David's criminal history, mistakes that echoed louder than the silence that followed them. But then he acknowledged the change, the effort, the consistency, the letters of recommendation submitted by Carl, a local pastor, and Ruth herself, a mother, whose words shook even the bailiff to the bone. "This isn't about erasing your past," the judge said slowly. "It's about recognizing that a man can be more than the worst thing he's ever done." David swallowed hard, his throat burning, tears stinging the corners of his eyes as he held the gaze of the man who held his future. He nodded once, unable to speak, overwhelmed by the truth of that sentence and the weight it lifted from his shoulders. Ruth reached out, pressing her hand against her chest, as if trying to steady her heart, her eyes brimming with a love that had never faltered. And when the gavel finally came down, and the words "record expunged" echoed through the room, it wasn't just justice, it was resurrection. David exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding since the day he was first arrested, and whispered, "Thank you." That night, Ruth made his favorite meal: jollof rice, fried plantains, grilled chicken with pepper sauce, and set the table with real candles, not just for light, but to mark the occasion as sacred. David helped in the kitchen, chopping onions and humming along to the old records she played, their laughter filling the home like music from a life neither of them thought they'd live to see. When they sat down to eat, they didn't speak for a while, choosing instead to let the taste of healing settle on their tongues. After a while, Ruth lifted her glass of water and raised it slightly, a quiet toast that needed no words, and David mirrored the gesture with a smile so soft it made her eyes well again. "I never thought I'd see this day," she said finally, her voice a whisper, not from weakness but from wonder. David reached across the table and took her hand, kissing her knuckles gently like a vow, and said, "You believed enough for both of us, Ma." That night, sleep came easy, like a long-lost friend returning to a room it once feared to enter. Then came the moment neither of them saw coming. A letter in the mail from the court system, notifying David of a hearing to expunge his record based on good behavior and community service. His hands trembled as he read the words aloud, barely believing that redemption might also come with a clean slate. Ruth covered her mouth with both hands and burst into tears, not out of fear but out of overwhelming gratitude for what they had survived together. They held each other for a long time, swaying in the hallway, the letter clutched between them like a symbol of everything they'd overcome. "Do you think it's really possible?" David asked, voice cracking with hope he hadn't dared to feel in years. And Ruth, without hesitation, answered, "Yes, baby, because you've earned this with blood, tears, and grace." The court date was set, and for the first time David walked into a courtroom not as a convict, but as a changed man reclaiming his future. And as the judge looked over the papers and nodded slowly, David closed his eyes and said silently, "Thank you, Ma, for every single no that saved my life." The morning sun filtered gently through the faded curtains of Ruth's kitchen as she stirred a pot of oatmeal, humming an old hymn her mother once sang in times of trial and triumph. The house was quiet, but it held a sense of peace that had long been missing, a stillness that came not from absence, but from healing that finally had room to breathe. She glanced at the kitchen table and saw David's empty cup from the night before, and something about it made her smile, the small, forgotten sign that he had stayed, eaten, lived, and chosen home again. In the small bowl beside the sink were the car keys she used to hide from him and a folded note he'd left that morning. "Off to apply for jobs. Love you, Ma." Her fingers traced the ink as though it were a prayer answered in script, and her eyes welled up with tears she didn't bother hiding. She had waited for this moment for years, not just for his return, but for the change that proved he wasn't just back. He was becoming, and in the warmth of that quiet kitchen, Ruth whispered a simple prayer, "Lord, thank you. Please keep him strong." David walked 3 miles that morning with a folder in hand, and his hopes tucked carefully behind his ribs, afraid to let them rise too high, yet unwilling to let them fall. Every shop he passed reminded him of how much had changed. The bookstores, the bakeries, the barber shops, places that once saw him as trouble, now looked at him with cautious curiosity. He stepped into a diner first, nervous but composed, and asked to speak with the manager, his voice calm but his palms sweating, as if the floor beneath him might collapse if he stumbled. The woman behind the counter looked him up and down, her expression unreadable, then nodded toward the back office, where a tired-looking man barely glanced up before muttering, "We don't hire ex-cons." David froze, his throat dry, the rejection hitting harder than he expected, like a door slamming not just on opportunity, but on his very identity. He thanked them anyway, walked out with his head high, and reminded himself of what his mother told him the night before. Rejection isn't failure, son, it's just a redirection. So he kept walking, kept knocking, and kept believing that one door someday would open. By midday his feet ached, his voice was hoarse, and his confidence had worn thin. But David refused to go home empty-handed, not because Ruth would be disappointed, but because he wasn't ready to disappoint himself. He stopped at a mechanic shop, run by a grizzled old man named Carl, whose oil-stained overalls and gruff tone reminded David of the kind of people who didn't have time for lies. "You ever worked on cars?" Carl asked, not looking up from the engine he was fixing, and David answered honestly, "No, sir, but I can learn. I learn fast, and I don't give up." There was a long silence, broken only by the clink of a wrench hitting the floor, and then Carl finally looked up and said, "Can't pay much, but you show up on time, and don't screw around. We'll see what happens." David could have cried, but instead he shook Carl's hand firm and steady, and said, "Thank you, sir, you won't regret it." As he walked home with grease on his hands and hope in his chest, David felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just relief, but pride. He was building something now, not destroying it. And for the first time, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise. David stood face to face with the friend who once felt like family, but now looked more like a stranger, carrying the weight of shared mistakes. The air between them was thick with the kind of silence that hurt to breathe, filled with questions, regret, and the remains of a loyalty that had shattered on impact. Jackson looked older, thinner, and despite his signature confidence, there was a tremble in his fingers and a hesitation in his eyes that betrayed him. David could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears as memories of the arrest, the courtroom, and the betrayal flooded his chest like a tide that refused to be ignored. Neither of them moved for a long moment, as if both were trying to measure the distance between past and present without stepping too far into either. "I didn't know what else to do," Jackson finally whispered, his voice hoarse and low, like he had rehearsed it 1,000 times and still didn't believe it would be enough. David swallowed hard and responded, "You could have told the truth, but instead you let me burn for your fire." Jackson looked down at the ground, like it might hold an answer, shame dripping from his shoulders like a heavy coat he couldn't take off. And David watched him, trying to decide if the pain on his face was real or rehearsed. "They threatened me, man," Jackson said, his voice cracking as he stepped forward slightly. "They said if I didn't give them a name, I'd go down hard, and you were already on thin ice, so they came for you first." David clenched his fists at the memory of being led away in cuffs, of hearing his mother cry out his name, of the look in her eyes that day that nearly broke him. "So you chose yourself," he said, through clenched teeth, the bitterness rising like smoke, "and threw me under like I meant nothing." Jackson shook his head quickly, stepping back as if burned, No, ma'am, it wasn't like that. I panicked. I didn't think, and I've hated myself every day since. David wanted to scream, to punch something, to tell Jackson that sorry wasn't enough. But then he remembered his mother's voice, soft and strong, telling him that healing was about choosing peace over punishment. So instead he took a deep breath, looked Jackson in the eyes and said, "Then say it, say you were wrong, and don't expect me to pretend it never happened." Jackson's voice dropped to a whisper as he looked up, tears glistening in his eyes, and said the words David didn't know he needed to hear. "I was wrong. I was a coward. I let you take the fall because I was scared, and it cost you everything. I've thought about coming here every day since you went away, but I didn't think you'd ever want to see me again. I saw your mum at the store once, and she just looked at me like I was invisible, and that hurt more than any fight ever could. I know sorry isn't enough, but I'm saying it anyway, because I need to own what I did. You were my brother, and I broke that bond, and I'll never forgive myself unless you find a way to." But not everything was perfect, and David knew healing came with pain, because every now and then he'd wake up with the memory of the handcuffs or the sound of the gavel still echoing in his ears. There were moments when shame crept in like a shadow, whispering that he didn't deserve to be home, to be forgiven, to be free. And in those moments he'd sit at his desk and write, not to escape, but to process. Sometimes he wrote to Jackson in his mind, asking questions he didn't expect answers to, trying to make sense of the betrayal, the anger, the friendship that had turned into fire. Other times he wrote to himself, letters to the boy he used to be, full of empathy and warning, so he'd never forget where the wrong road led. Ruth noticed the shifts in his mood, but gave him space to feel without rushing him to be okay, because she understood healing was more than just returning home. It was learning how to live again. She'd leave small notes around the house, like reminders of love. You are not your past, or your story still matters, or I'm proud of you, always. And every time he read one, David felt a little stronger, a little steadier, a little more certain that he was becoming who he was always meant to be. One afternoon, while David was sweeping the porch, he noticed a familiar figure across the street. Jackson, standing beside his bike, hands in his pockets, looking like a ghost from a chapter that hadn't quite ended. David froze, the broom slipping from his hand, his heart thundering in his chest, unsure if this was a confrontation, a coincidence, or something in between. Jackson didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there watching with a look that flickered between guilt and hope, like he was trying to decide whether to walk away or say something that mattered. Ruth stepped outside then, saw them both, and gently touched David's arm, whispering, "It's your call." For a long moment, David just stood there, breathing heavy, trying to measure whether forgiveness was bravery or foolishness, whether silence would be strength or cowardice. But then he remembered the letter he sent, the choice he made to be better, not bitter, and he nodded once, more to himself than anyone else. He stepped off the porch and began to walk toward Jackson, each step slow but certain, carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. And when they finally stood face to face, Jackson opened his mouth, but David spoke first. "You showed up. That's a start." David woke up the next morning feeling heavier than the night before, though the peace they found on the porch still lingered softly in his chest, like a fragile ember waiting to catch fire. The world outside his window seemed different, not because anything had changed, but because he had changed inside, as if the weight of guilt had lifted just enough to let hope breathe. Ruth was already in the kitchen, humming a hymn as she prepared breakfast, her movements slow but steady, as if each step was a prayer for the day ahead. He sat down silently, watching her silhouette framed by the golden light pouring through the window, and realized how much strength it took to be her, how many battles she fought silently for his sake. The memories of nights spent alone, with only his mother's voice in his head telling him to come home, were sharp but less painful now, replaced by something new: determination. "I want to do more," David said quietly, breaking the silence between them like breaking dawn. "Not just for me, but for others like me who don't know where to turn." Ruth smiled, eyes moist with pride, and told him that the first step to healing was walking the path honestly, without shortcuts or regrets. Later that week, David returned to the church, this time not as a confessor, but as a volunteer, offering to help repair the community center that had fallen into neglect during his years of absence. The building was cracked and dusty, much like the broken promises he carried inside, but with every sweep of the broom and coat of paint, he felt the walls whispering forgiveness, welcoming him back to the place where his mother's faith had kept him alive. The other volunteers were cautious at first, watching the young man who once was known for fights and trouble, but now carried himself with a quiet resolve that spoke louder than words. Among them was Pastor James, who approached David one afternoon and said, "Your story gave these people hope more than you realize, and hope is the foundation of every second chance." David nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders, but also ignite a spark of purpose that was stronger than any fear. That evening, he called Carl and told him about the project, inviting him to join, hoping to rebuild more than just walls. Carl agreed without hesitation, their friendship forging a new chapter written not in mistakes, but in shared redemption. Thank you for watching this powerful story of love, loss, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. He ignored his mom's advice, and it cost him everything. Reminds us that sometimes the hardest lessons lead to the greatest transformations. If this emotional journey moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on the value of family, obedience, and second chances, then you'll love what we have coming next. We dive deep into true stories, emotional tales, and dramatic moments from real lives that teach unforgettable lessons. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more gripping, in-depth history and life-changing stories every week. The weeks that followed were bittersweet, full of new boys arriving and old boys stepping up to lead. And every lesson David taught now felt like a tribute to his mother's legacy. He often heard her voice in his head, not scolding but guiding, soft reminders of humility, respect, and the kind of strength that bends but doesn't break. Jalen became one of the most dedicated volunteers, always quoting Ruth's wisdom like scripture, reminding others that love was a discipline, not just a feeling. David watched the center bloom with life and purpose, the walls now covered in photos and letters from boys who once had no one, now calling each other brothers. And every time he welcomed a new face, he'd say, "You're not just here for help. You're here to heal, to grow, and to find your way back home." The past no longer haunted him. It empowered him because the pain that once threatened to destroy him now served as the foundation for his life's greatest work. And Ruth's spirit lived in every hug, every meal, every lesson, and every boy who chose to rise again. On what would have been Ruth's 72nd birthday, David launched the Ruth Wells Foundation, a scholarship and mentoring fund for boys from broken homes, dedicated to mothers who never gave up. The first recipient was a 17-year-old boy named Micah, who had been sleeping in stairwells before finding refuge at the center. And when he was handed the award, he whispered, "Tell Miss Ruth thank you. David smiled through tears, imagining his mother's face lighting up with joy, and said, "She already knows." The story made headlines from jail cell to hope dealer. And though David didn't care for fame, he welcomed the spotlight if it helped more boys find the way back to themselves. He often ended his talks by saying, "I had to lose everything before I realized my mother had given me everything." And those words became the heartbeat of the foundation. Churches, schools, and organizations began to partner with the center, offering resources, therapy, and even jobs to the boys. What began as one mother's hope became a movement. And David knew now that obedience and humility weren't about submission. They were about love strong enough to build a life on. Years passed, and David's hair grayed at the temples, his face carrying the lines of both sorrow and joy, each wrinkle a testimony of battles fought and won. He never married, though he loved deeply, but he always said his greatest relationship was the one he had with his mother, even after she was gone. In moments of silence, he'd sit on the porch with her Bible, rereading her notes in the margins, feeling her presence in the wind and the rustling leaves. Sometimes he'd hear a boy laughing inside the center and think of his younger self, lost, angry, and unaware of how deeply he was loved. He would smile and say quietly, "You made it, kid," as if speaking to the ghost of the boy he used to be. And though grief never fully left, it stopped hurting like it once did. It became a quiet companion that reminded him of love's power. On the wall of the center hung a framed photo of Ruth and a plaque that read, "She believed in him, so he believed in others." One evening, as David was locking up after a long day, he heard a soft voice call out, "Mr. David," and turned to see a young boy clutching a torn backpack and wearing fear like a coat. He knelt and asked gently, "What's your name, son?" And the boy replied, "Ezra. I don't have anywhere to go." David opened the door without hesitation, the same way Ruth had once left the door open for him, and said, "Well, Ezra, you do now." That night, he gave the boy a blanket, some warm food, and one of Ruth's letters, the last copy he had kept safe for the right moment. As Ezra read it, his eyes filled with the same tears David once shed, and something unspoken passed between them, a bridge of pain and promise built across generations. In that moment, David realized the work would never truly end, because as long as there were boys who needed home, Ruth's love would never die. He turned off the lights, looked at the stars and whispered, "Thank you, Mama, we're still building." It was a quiet morning in early spring when David found the envelope tucked into the back of Ruth's old Bible, yellowed at the corners and sealed with a trembling hand. He hadn't seen it before, not through all the days they had sorted boxes, not through the nights he sat by her bedside when her body began to slow, but something about it made him pause. Written in her familiar looping handwriting were the words for David, "When you're ready," and something in his chest tightened with the weight of finality. Ruth had passed in her sleep 2 nights earlier, peaceful and smiling, her hands folded as if in prayer. And though David had prepared himself, nothing could truly soften the blow. He held the letter against his chest for a long time before opening it, afraid that reading her words would make her absence feel even more real, more permanent. Finally, as the sun poured through the window, he unfolded the paper and began to read, her voice rising gently from each line, like a lullaby he'd forgotten he once knew. And what he read would echo through his heart for the rest of his life. "My dear son," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then it means my time here has ended. But don't grieve too long, my love, because I am not truly gone." Her words were warm, like her hands, gentle like her prayers, and strong like the arms that had held him through his darkest nights. She reminded him of the boy he once was, of the anger that masked pain, of the pride that once deafened him to the sound of love, and how she had never stopped believing that he'd come home. "You broke my heart more times than you know," she wrote. "But you also filled it more than anyone ever could, because even in your rebellion, I saw your potential burning quietly beneath the ashes." David felt his throat tighten as he read her forgiveness, her hope, her unwavering belief that no soul is ever too far gone for grace to reach. "You taught me patience," she said. "You taught me how to love through pain, and now you've shown the world how to turn pain into purpose." By the end of the letter, David was weeping like a child again, not from guilt, but from a gratitude so deep it felt like prayer. He folded the letter carefully, kissed it, and placed it in the same drawer where he once kept her unopened words, now sacred and alive with new meaning. The house felt quiet without her, too still in places where her laughter used to live. But David knew he couldn't let grief drown the mission she had breathed life into. At the center, the boys gathered, some of them learning about her passing for the first time, and their tears mirrored his, raw, aching, real. One of them asked, "Is the center going to close now?" And David shook his head, standing a little taller, his voice steady with promise. "No," he said, "this isn't just my work. It was hers too, and we'll carry it together, just like she carried me." They held a memorial under the stars, candles flickering on every table, and each boy wrote a letter to Ruth, telling her what she meant to them. It was the most sacred night David had ever witnessed, filled with laughter, tears, and the unmistakable presence of love that death could not erase. One night, Jalen didn't show up, and David felt that old panic rise in his throat, the kind he hadn't tasted since the nights his mother used to sit waiting in the window. He drove around town searching for him, his headlights sweeping over alleyways, convenience stores and parks where boys got lost in shadows. Finally, he found Jalen on a corner, blood on his shirt and fear in his voice, as two older boys were trying to pull him into a car for a deal that would likely end in cuffs or worse. David jumped out without thinking, placing himself between Jalen and the danger, his voice steady but commanding, saying, "He's not going with you, he's coming with me." The older boys scoffed, one of them pulling a blade, but David stood tall, never flinching, until finally they drove off, leaving behind only smoke and silence. Jalen dropped to his knees, sobbing like a child, and David held him just like Ruth had once held him, whispering, "I've got you, I won't let go." In that moment, David knew the fire in his soul had finally found its purpose. When they got back to the center, Jalen refused to let go of David's arm, and Ruth wrapped both of them in a blanket like they were her own. That night, David sat Jalen down and gave him the same talk Ruth had once tried to give him, the one about choices and consequences, and the kind of man you become when no one is watching. Jalen didn't speak at first, but when he finally did, he asked, "Why do you even care?" And David said, "Because someone cared for me when I didn't deserve it, and I promised I'd do the same." That simple truth cracked something in Jalen, and he nodded slowly, letting the walls inside him fall for the first time in years. Ruth watched them from the doorway, her eyes shining with quiet pride, and whispered to herself, "This is why we never stop loving them, even when it hurts." That night was a turning point, not just for Jalen, but for David, who realized that redemption is never just for you. It's meant to be passed on, in the quiet of the night, surrounded by second chances. David felt the weight of legacy in his hands. News of the center began to spread. And slowly, people who once whispered about Ruth's troubled son now praised his courage, his work, and his transformation. David was invited to speak at schools, churches, and even a juvenile detention center, where he told his story to boys in orange jumpsuits, each one carrying the weight of regret. He looked them in the eyes and said, "It's never too late to change, but don't wait until everything is gone. Start now, start broken, just start." Some laughed, others cried, but each time he left behind a seed, planted in hard soil, knowing some would bloom, and others might not, but all were worthy of the attempt. Ruth sat in the audience every time, never once missing a talk, her hands clasped tightly in prayer and pride. One day after a speech, a teacher approached her and said, "You must be proud," and she simply replied, "I'm grateful." Pride fades, but gratitude stays forever. That night, David hugged her and said, "You were the lighthouse, Mama, even when I was drowning." But it wasn't always smooth. There were days the center ran out of funds, nights boys ran away, and moments when David questioned if he was making any real difference. Ruth reminded him that impact isn't measured by numbers but by names, by Jalen, by Chris, by the one who came back just to say thank you. In one of the hardest weeks, David opened a drawer and found one of Ruth's old letters to him, reread it, and found the strength to keep going when quitting felt easier. He realized that the reason he didn't give up wasn't because he was strong. It was because someone had believed in him long enough to make him believe too. He knelt beside Ruth's chair and said, "Even when I had nothing to offer, you gave me everything." And she placed her hand on his cheek and whispered, "That's what love does. It gives without expecting." Their bond, forged in fire and mended with grace, was now unbreakable, a testimony that would outlive them both. In the quiet corners of their story, they found a kind of peace that comes not from avoiding pain, but from turning it into purpose. That winter, the center celebrated its first year, and David invited every boy who had walked through its doors, including the ones who had left, to come home for a dinner under the stars. Tables were set with care, lights strung across the yard, and Ruth's cooking filled the air with warmth that smelled like love. Boys hugged David like a brother, like a father, like a man they wished they had met sooner, and Ruth held their hands like a mother would, even if just for one night. At the end of the evening, David stood with a microphone, his voice breaking as he said, "This isn't a program, it's a second chance disguised as a family." The boys clapped. Some cried, and many whispered thank you into the night air, like a prayer answered. As the stars blinked above, and music drifted softly in the background, Ruth leaned into David and said, This is what healing looks like." And David, wiping a tear from his cheek, replied, "I used to run from the light. Now I build it for others." The sun rose on a Saturday morning with the scent of dew on the grass and calm in the air. But inside David's chest was a storm he didn't quite understand. He had been feeling restless, not in the way that begged for escape, but in the way that whispered, "You have more to give." As he stood in front of the mirror brushing his hair, he caught a glimpse of the man he had become, no longer the boy who sneered at wisdom, but someone carrying the weight of redemption. The past clung to him like a tattoo, but now it was inked in grace, not regret, and it reminded him that pain has purpose when you let it shape you. Ruth noticed the fire in his eyes, the one that used to burn with rebellion, now softened and redirected into service. She said, "You look like your father when he finally found peace." And David smiled, thinking how strange it was that healing made you resemble the ones who first taught you pain. He hugged her tightly and whispered, "I want to help boys like me, Mama, boys who still think they're too far gone." Ruth sat him down with a warm cup of cocoa and her gentle wisdom, and she listened without interrupting as David explained his idea to start a youth program for troubled boys. He didn't want it to be religious in name, but he wanted the values to shine through every lesson, every conversation, every open door. "I want to be the man I needed," he said, his voice steady, but his hands trembling with the weight of the dream. Ruth nodded slowly, tears gathering at the edges of her eyes, and said, "Then you will be, because no one can speak to pain like someone who's walked through it and lived to love again." They planned the name, the mission, the stories he would share, and Ruth offered to write letters to the mothers of the boys, just like the ones she wrote to David. They both knew it would be hard work, filled with heartbreak and setbacks, but they also knew that nothing worth building ever comes without sacrifice. That night, they prayed together, something they hadn't done in years, and David wept, not from shame this time, but from gratitude. Weeks turned into months, and the small community center they rented became a beacon of light to boys who had once known only darkness. David stood before them, week after week, sharing his story with raw honesty and firm compassion, letting them see the scars on his heart without hiding the healing. Some boys rolled their eyes just like he once did, and others broke down crying in the back of the room, hearing their own story told out loud. He gave them a place to sleep when they got kicked out, a place to eat when hunger became their only companion, and most importantly, a place to be seen. Ruth often stood in the corner, watching her son hold space for young men who were fighting their own demons, her heart splitting and mending all at once. She cooked for them, prayed for them, and wrote them letters just like she did for David, folding each one with care and tucking them into the boys' bags. One of the boys, Jalen, reminded David of himself so much that it scared him, especially the anger behind his eyes and the fear masked as defiance. As the book's message traveled, so did David and Ruth, invited to speak at panels and mother-son retreats, their bond now a testament to what healing looks like in real time. One moment in particular stood out. A young woman approached them after a talk and said her brother had just been arrested, and she didn't know whether to keep hoping or give up. Ruth looked her in the eye and said, "Hope doesn't mean pretending it doesn't hurt. It means believing it's not the end." David gently placed a copy of their book in her hand and said, "Tell him there's still a way back, but it starts with knowing someone is waiting." The girl cried and hugged them both, and as they watched her walk away, David whispered, "Every time we share our story, Mama, I feel like we're still writing it." Ruth nodded, her heart swelling with a peace she hadn't known in years, and said, "Because stories like ours don't end, they just keep redeeming." The moments were simple but powerful, tiny echoes of the miracle they had lived through, proof that love never returns empty. And every time they returned home, the silence of the house felt a little softer, like even the walls had begun to breathe again. One evening, Ruth sat alone on the porch, watching the stars like old friends, when David walked out with 2 mugs of warm tea, a quiet tradition they'd recently revived. As they sipped in silence, Ruth said softly, "You know, I used to think I'd never have a normal conversation with you again. No tea, no porch, no peace." David leaned his head back and looked at the sky, his voice steady as he replied, "I didn't know what peace looked like, Mama, until I saw it in your eyes again." She smiled and said, "Peace isn't always quiet, David. Sometimes it's loud and messy, but when it comes you feel it in your bones." He reached for her hand, grateful for the thousands of quiet moments she had dreamed of this one, when he was too far to hear it calling. "You taught me that love doesn't always fix everything right away," he whispered. but it plants something that can grow if we don't give up. Ruth squeezed his hand, her heart aching in the most beautiful way, and said, "You came back to me, David, and that's more than enough." As the stars shone overhead and the night wrapped itself around them, they sat in the stillness of all that had been restored. One evening, as the sky turned orange with the fading sun, Ruth called David into the small room that used to be his childhood bedroom, now kept tidy like a museum of memories. On the bed lay a box covered in dust and tied with a faded ribbon, something Ruth had kept hidden for years, waiting for the right moment to hand it over. She told him that during the years he was gone, she wrote him letters she never sent, pouring into them the words her heart needed to say, even when her mouth could not. With trembling hands, David opened the box and found dozens of envelopes, each one dated and sealed with care, like small time capsules of love and heartbreak. As he opened the first letter, Ruth quietly left the room, knowing that some moments must be faced in solitude, especially the ones that hold the weight of everything unsaid. David began to read, and with each word, the past unfolded like a film reel, his mother's prayers, her pain, her hopes that someday her son would find his way home. The letters weren't bitter or angry. They were soaked in grace, filled with gentle pleas, scripture, and the kind of unconditional love that only a mother can carry through the fire. He read for hours, stopping only to wipe his tears as they dropped like rain onto the pages that held pieces of his mother's soul. Some letters were written after long nights of crying, others after birthdays missed or news of his trouble in the streets, each one a thread woven into the fabric of her enduring faith. In one, she wrote, "If you ever come back to me, I'll pretend you never left. I'll just hold you and call it a new beginning." Another read, "Even if the world forgets who you are, I never will, because I carried you before I knew your name, and I loved you before you knew mine." Her words wrapped around him like a blanket, softening the shame that still clung to the corners of his spirit, showing him that his journey was never just his, it was theirs. He felt the years between them collapse under the weight of these letters, the distance shrinking into something almost holy, like love had rewritten the story from the inside out. When he finally reached the last letter, dated only a few months before his return, he found these words, "If today is not the day you come home, I'll wait again tomorrow, and the next day, and every day after, because love doesn't count the days. It just hopes." David folded the letter slowly and pressed it to his chest, the sound of his sobs muffled by the weight of everything he'd once run from. The next morning, David placed all the letters into a new binder and labeled it "The Book of My Return," deciding it would never gather dust again. It would sit on his desk as a daily reminder of what it cost to come home. Ruth smiled when she saw it, though her eyes turned glassy, because she knew that those pages were more than just ink. They were the lifeline that had kept her hope alive in the silence. David asked her if she would help him publish a version of the letters as a book, one that could help other parents who were waiting for their prodigal children. Ruth hesitated, unsure if her pain was meant to be public, but David held her hand and said, "Your story is their strength, Mama, just like it was mine." Together they typed each letter, formatting them carefully, adding reflections from David's present-day thoughts, bridging the years between them with grace. They titled it "Love Waits, Letters to the Lost and Found," and submitted it to a small Christian publisher who wept while reading it, and immediately said yes. The book released quietly, but spread quickly, touching lives in places David and Ruth could never physically reach, opening doors to churches, schools, and rehabilitation centers. But even as the community celebrated his transformation, a storm brewed quietly inside David, one rooted in shame, a question he hadn't dared ask since coming home. One rainy morning, as thunder rumbled in the distance and the sky wept like it remembered too much, David finally turned to Ruth and asked, "Did I ruin your life, Mama, when I left, when I hurt you?" The question broke something unspoken between them, dragging all the old pain back into the light. But Ruth didn't flinch or cry. She simply reached for his hand and held it firmly. "You didn't ruin my life," she said, her voice strong like a hymn. "You were my life, David. And though it broke me to watch you fall, it would have killed me to stop believing you'd rise." Tears streamed down his face as he collapsed into her embrace. Years of buried guilt pouring out like floodwaters finally breaching a dam. They sat there for hours, the storm outside echoing the one inside them. But by nightfall, both skies had cleared, leaving behind the scent of renewal and the silence of peace. From that day forward, David no longer asked whether he deserved her love. He simply lived like he did, and that made all the difference. Ruth, for her part, continued to pray every night, not for change, but for strength, to keep loving the way God loved, without condition and without end. As months passed, David was invited to speak at a regional youth summit, where counselors and mentors from across the state gathered to share ideas and strategies. It was the biggest stage he'd stood on yet, and as he looked at the packed auditorium, he felt the pressure of expectation rise like a tide. But then he looked down at the front row and saw Ruth, her hands folded, her eyes locked on his, her quiet presence louder than any crowd, and the fear melted away. He spoke not as a polished speaker, but as a son, a survivor, a man still learning how to walk in grace one day at a time. His story resonated deeply, not because it was perfect, but because it was real, flawed, painful, and filled with moments that reminded every listener that redemption is messy but beautiful. Afterward, a man in his 50s approached David and said, "I ignored my mother too, and I lost her before I could say sorry. Thank you for reminding me it's never too late to live in a way that honors her." David hugged him tightly, feeling the sacred weight of shared regret and renewed purpose, and silently thanked God for giving his pain a platform. Backstage, Ruth embraced him with pride in her heart and whispered, "Now they know what I've always known. You were never a lost cause." David stood at the threshold of a small high school auditorium, his heart pounding louder than the voices echoing inside, as he prepared to speak to a room full of boys who mirrored the fire and fear he once carried. The microphone trembled in his grip, not because of nerves, but because he now understood the weight of words, especially the ones his mother had used to build bridges he once burned. As he looked into their eyes, some defiant, some empty, some quietly hopeful, he didn't see strangers but versions of himself, waiting for someone to see past the mask. He cleared his throat and began his story, not from the beginning but from the moment it all went wrong, describing in vivid detail the day he spat on his mother's dreams and walked into the arms of the streets. He told them how fast freedom becomes a prison, how pride can blind a man from the very hands reaching out to save him, and how it took losing everything to hear his mother's voice again in his soul. The boys listened, fidgeting at first, but eventually still, like their hearts were catching fire from his honesty, like his pain had become their warning. When he finished, there was no applause, just silence, and the quiet ripple of understanding, the kind that shifts something inside you without making a sound. That night, David returned home to find Ruth, sitting alone at the dining table, her Bible open beside a cold cup of tea, her glasses perched low as if reading between verses. He sat down beside her without a word, laid his head on her shoulder like he used to as a child, and whispered, "I did it, Mama. I think they heard me. She smiled without looking up, gently placing her hand over his, and said, "Then the seed has been planted, and God will water it in his time." They sat like that for a long time, two souls stitched back together by suffering and survival, knowing that healing doesn't come all at once, but in quiet moments of connection. David told her about Maria and the mentoring program, about Carl's progress, about the kids who cried after hearing his story, and the boy who hugged him tightly like a lifeline. Ruth's eyes shimmered with tears she no longer needed to hide, because she finally saw the fruit of her labor, not in speeches or applause, but in the man her son was becoming. "I used to think I was cursed," David said softly, "but now I know I was just lost, and you never stopped looking for me." Ruth cupped his face in her hands, kissed his forehead and whispered, "Love doesn't give up, David. It waits, it prays, and it believes even when the world doesn't." One afternoon, while reviewing plans for expanding the youth program, David received a call from the local newspaper asking if they could feature his story in a column about second chances. At first he hesitated, unsure if he wanted his past dragged into the open again. But Ruth encouraged him to share, not for fame but for freedom, because truth told in love heals both speaker and listener. The article ran with the title, "From Lost to Leader, One Son's Redemption," and it spread across the community like wildfire, reigniting old wounds but also reopening hearts. Messages poured in from former classmates, old neighbors, and even one of the police officers who had once arrested him, each note carrying pieces of forgiveness and shared humanity. David saved every message, printed them out, and placed them in a scrapbook titled "Proof that Change is Real," something he would one day show his own children, should God give him that blessing. Ruth smiled as she flipped through the pages, her fingers trembling at the picture of the young boy he once was, and the man he now became, side by side like bookends of the same story. "Your pain had a purpose," she said one evening, as they sat on the porch beneath the stars, "and now you're helping others find theirs before it's too late." David's days quickly filled with routine, hard work, and new connections, but nights were harder, haunted by dreams of the past and questions about the future. One night, he woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, as if running from something invisible, and found Ruth sitting by his bed, with a glass of water and her hand on his forehead. "You don't have to carry everything alone," she whispered, and those words became a balm to his restless soul. The following day, David began attending support groups, sitting in circles with men and women who bore scars of their own, some fresh, some deep-rooted, all connected by the universal need for forgiveness and understanding. He listened more than he spoke, learning that humility was not weakness, but the courage to admit brokenness and ask for help. Each story chipped away the walls around his heart, until he realized that true strength was found in vulnerability, and that respect was earned not through fear, but through honesty. Ruth watched this transformation with tears in her eyes, grateful that her son was learning to see himself not as a victim or villain, but as a survivor and healer. One afternoon, a young woman named Maria approached David after a meeting, her hands trembling as she handed him a flyer for a local youth mentoring program. She told him how she had once been lost in the same darkness, and how one person's kindness had changed her life. "If you can be that person for someone else," she said softly, "you'll be living the lesson your mum taught you." David felt a lump in his throat and promised to try, realizing that gratitude was more than words. It was action, sacrifice, and the willingness to give what was freely given to him. He began visiting a nearby school to speak with teenagers who reminded him of himself, sharing not just his mistakes but the hope that they could choose a different path. At first, the students were skeptical, hardened by their own struggles and doubt. But slowly, as David shared his story with openness and no shame, walls began to crumble. Parents and teachers took notice, and what started as a small gesture blossomed into a community movement aimed at healing broken families and guiding lost youth. Ruth stood at the sidelines during one of his talks, her heart swelling with pride, knowing the boy who once ignored her advice was now a man who embodied it. Despite the progress, David's journey was far from smooth, as old enemies and memories still lurked in the shadows, testing his resolve and patience. One evening as he walked home from a mentoring session, a familiar voice called out from an alley, sending chills down his spine. The voice of Rico, the man who once threatened to destroy everything. Rico laughed coldly and said, "You think you're better than us now? You think you can escape the family you were born into?" David squared his shoulders, feeling the strength of his new identity pulse through his veins, and replied, "I'm not running anymore. I'm standing here because I finally know what family means, and it's not what you taught me." Rico's sneer faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of something like respect or regret, before he disappeared into the darkness, leaving David standing tall in the light of his own redemption. That night, David called Ruth and told her about the encounter, and they prayed together, knowing that battles weren't always won with fists, but with faith and forgiveness. As the days passed, David grew more certain that his mother's wisdom, though ignored for years, had been the compass that guided him back home.